Good morning. This is the time and place for the March Board of Oil, Gas, and Mining hearing. It is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021. Before we begin, I once again need to read the electronic meeting determination public announcement. I, Chris Hansen, Chairman of the Board of Oil, Gas, and Mining, have determined the March 2021 public meeting will be held electronically. This determination is based on the following facts. Utah continues to be affected by the COVID-19 global pandemic. Although Salt Lake County has entered a moderate transmission phase, the Utah Department of Health has issued State Public Health Order 2021-7, which contains certain protocols directed at controlling the spread of the COVID-19 virus by minimizing face-to-face interactions. At this time, the physical space utilized for public meetings within the Utah DNR building is insufficient to maintain effective social distancing, and the board is unable to ensure proper safety protocols are in place to guarantee safe participation to the public. The board has been using an electronic platform allowing interested parties to fully participate while also allowing the public to independently view the public meeting and offer public comment. Under the circumstances, the electronic platform currently available is a safer alternative to face-to-face public participation. This determination will expire 30 days from today's date. The board, division, and the Department of Natural Resources will evaluate the public health and safety conditions existing before the April 2021 public meeting and inform the public as to how that meeting will proceed as soon as possible. Having read that, I believe I can now go ahead and we can start the briefing. And I will turn the time over to Director John Bozza.
Chairman Hansen, and thank you to members of the board for your participation in today's meeting. It has been a long year for all of us, and I know that one of the things that I need to state right from the beginning is my appreciation for all of the board members for your valuable service. But especially to Mr. Brown and Ms. Davis, because I know that you have board terms that have expired recently, and I certainly appreciate your attendance and participation today. We are growing closer to working with the governor's office on appointments and reappointments, but obviously they've had a lot on their plate besides making appointments to boards and commissions. But I think that we'll get some answers from them in the very near future. And I'll reach out to both of you and let you know what is transpiring in that regard at another time. But again, thank you all for your participation and service today. We're going to start today's briefing session with an item that if you were watching closely at the legislative session, you would see that there was an underlying interest in what are termed critical minerals in the state of Utah. And it entered into several discussions that the legislature was having this year. Well, we felt that this was a valuable opportunity to present to the board an overview of critical minerals and what they mean in the state of Utah. So to do that today, I'm going to turn the time over to Dana Dean, our Deputy Director for Mining, and she'll introduce the team that is going to be presenting to you today. So Dana, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you, Director Bozza, Mr. Chair, and the board. As John said, we will be giving a presentation on critical minerals. It is a hot topic. The Department of Interior made a listing of minerals that they think are critical to the nation's economy and defense, and that's what we will be talking about today. I'm just here to introduce the experts, and they are Paul Baker, our minerals program manager, who will talk about the permitting and production of these minerals in the state of Utah, and Andrew Rupke and Stephanie Mills, both from the Utah Geological Survey, who have studied this extensively and in fact have written a paper that they'll mention in their presentation. If anyone would like a copy of that paper or a link to it, please let me know and I would be glad to pass that on. But I'll turn the time over to Paul, Andrew, and Stephanie.
Good morning. I'm going to present a PowerPoint, and this was,
Paul, could you please introduce yourself for the record?
oh, sorry. I'm Paul Baker. I'm manager of the Minerals Regulatory Program. And let's see, let's get this up. Hopefully you can see the slides. And I appreciate Stephanie Mills and Andrew Rupke from the Utah Geological Survey helping with this and actually putting this the majority of this PowerPoint together too. So Dana Dean talked a little bit about the definition of critical minerals, and here's, I guess, the official definition. Mineral materials essential to the economic and national security of the United States. And I think it's primarily, although not exclusively, things, minerals where the supply chain could be disrupted. A lot of these are produced mostly in other countries. United States has limited production, although that's not entirely the case. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And Dana mentioned some publications from the Utah Geological Survey, and I'll let Andrew and Stephanie talk about these just a little bit.
So, hi, I'm Andrew Rupke. I'm part of the Energy and Minerals program at the UGS. Stephanie and I are both part of that program. And really sort of our goal as part of that program is to make Utah's mineral resource information available to whoever needs it. And as part of that, I want to point you to a couple of publications because we're really going to only have a chance to kind of scratch the surface of the critical mineral resources in the state. And so this first publication there on the left, Critical Minerals of Utah, is a publication that Stephanie and I wrote last year. She secured some funding from the USGS to do this and did a lot of the heavy lifting for the report. And that has a lot more detail in it than we'll be able to go into today. So I encourage you to check that out. But we also produce a publication annually that kind of covers mining developments in the state. And that's, we call that Utah Mining and then whatever the year is. And we produce that annually. And you can go into that publication each year as well and find out what kind of mineral developments are going on in the state. And that will include critical minerals.
Okay. Andrew, Andrew, Stephanie, if you could talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew and Paul, for starting us off. I'm Stephanie Mills. I'm the other geologist from the UGS here today. Andrew and I will switch back and forth. Andrew's specialty falls within the industrial minerals space, and mine falls within the metalliferous mineral commodity space. So that's kind of how we tend to divide things that we talk about. So what we have here is a periodic table. This is actually a figure from the critical mineral report that Andrew just spoke about. And just to help people with reading this, so the outlines on each box correspond to the traditional groups on the periodic table that you would be familiar with. So alkali metals, lanthanides, metals, nonmetals, things like that. But the box colors themselves correspond to how the critical minerals, so the only ones we have highlighted on the table are actually critical mineral commodities, and basically what their status in Utah is at the moment. So I'll go through just the active producers for now because we have more slides to go into more detail. So those are the ones in red, and we have also added a few arrows that I'll address because it seems to be the second that you publish anything, it goes out of date because the industry moves on. So first, Utah is producing beryllium, magnesium, we say potassium, but actually in terms of the mineral commodity, this is potash, helium, also rhenium, palladium, and platinum. So those are the things that we currently produce in Utah. In addition to that, we have also started producing lithium in Utah, and we'll go into more detail about each of these commodities. We also flagged fluorine. The mineral commodity for that is fluorite, so we tend to say fluorite. We're also on the cusp. We've had slight past production of fluorite, and there is a company very, very close to restarting production there. So we went ahead and flagged it because we anticipate that will become actively produced soon. And also tellurium, for anyone who saw, Kennecott is planning to add an additional extraction stream to their refinery that will capture tellurium. So we anticipate tellurium also being produced as a byproduct soon. So this overview figure is a good one to reference. I would say if you have any questions and you just want a quick snapshot of what's going on in Utah, again, this is in the report that we mentioned on the previous slide.
Okay, I'll go into some of the production that's going on in Utah. So Utah is, as it says on the slide, the leading global producer of beryllium. It produces about 65% of the world's beryllium. And Utah has the only mine in the world that's dedicated entirely to beryllium production. This slide shows the tons of beryllium ore that have been produced from the mine. The oil, gas, and mining's annual reports require the amount of ore that's produced, not the finished product. So in 2018, for example, you can see there was no ore produced, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a finished product produced at the processing plant, which is near the IPP power plant near Delta. And Stephanie and Andrew, I don't know if you want to add anything more to this to talk about the geology or anything.
I was just going to add quickly. So Spore Mountain is a really unique geologic province. It's more or less the only type of beryllium deposit of its kind in the world. So we mine a mineral called bertrandite, whereas most beryllium in the world comes from the mineral beryl. And Spore Mountain itself is actually responsible for 65% of the world's beryllium production. So it's a very, very significant operation. And the reason that it is deemed critical as in terms of critical minerals, because normally when we think of critical minerals, we think of things we don't produce here. But actually, in this case, the U.S. has such a dependency on a single source, such a dependency on Spore Mountain. If anything were to compromise Spore Mountain, then it becomes a danger for the supply chain. So just to explain how the criticality kind of factors in for this particular mineral commodity.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that elaboration. And I don't know too much about helium, so the minerals program doesn't regulate extraction of helium. So I'll let Stephanie and Andrew talk a little bit more about this.
So we do have some helium resources in the state. If you look at this map here, what you can see are areas that show what are considered economic concentrations of helium. Sort of those pink areas are oil and gas fields that have showed economic concentrations. And then the black dots are singular wells that have showed economic concentrations of helium. Helium accumulates similar to oil and gas, so it tends to be a byproduct of oil and gas production. We've produced helium from Harley Dome in the past. And but there's not currently production coming from that area, but there is some production coming from Lisbon Valley. I don't know if you guys can see my arrow or not, but so if you see the little label down there, Lisbon Gas Plant, there is some helium production currently coming from that area. It's producing helium from out of state, but it also is producing some helium from nearby oil and gas fields there at Lisbon Valley. I do want to point you to a study. Tyler Wiseman from SITLA just recently did a very comprehensive study on helium in Utah, and that's been a really useful publication to kind of get a handle on what's going on with helium in the state, and that's available at the UGS website. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in helium.
Okay, thank you. Talk a little bit about lithium. Lithium is currently being produced as a byproduct from the by the U.S. magnesium plant on the west side of the Great Salt Lake. And since it's secondary processing, it's not something that's regulated by oil, gas, and mining. But there's also been some exploration going on in southeastern Utah in the Paradox Basin area by a company called the Anson Resources, or A1 Lithium. But right now there is no production going on down there.
So, and I would just add to that, most lithium or interest in lithium in the state has been in brine resources. And so what you're looking at on the map there in those pink areas are enriched brines. And it's important to note that the concentrations of lithium that we see in these brines are a little bit below what's currently considered economic in most places. And we have a little bit of a compounding factor in Utah in that our brines tend to be magnesium enriched. It's really expensive to separate magnesium and lithium. And so that is a problem that some groups are running into in Utah. But that's sort of why it makes so much sense for U.S. Magnesium to produce lithium, because as part of their magnesium refining process, they're actually separating the magnesium from the lithium. And so they just have a full step ahead of anybody else in producing in the state.
Okay, and so since we're talking about U.S. Magnesium, they have their plant near Raleigh on the west side of the Great Salt Lake. It's the only producer of magnesium metal in North America, and my understanding is that they produce about 2% of the world's supply. The annual reports are confidential, so I can't present production information. Anything more you'd add, Stephanie? I guess it would probably be Stephanie.
Actually, since this one is a brine product, this is definitely Andrew.
Okay.
So again, we have a variety of potential resources for magnesium. You're kind of looking at some of the same polygons in those pink areas there where there's potential for magnesium and brine. As it turns out, Compass Minerals up on Great Salt Lake and Intrepid over in Wendover, they're actually producing they're not producing magnesium metal like U.S. Magnesium, but they are producing some magnesium chloride. So those are potential resources in the future if others were to produce magnesium metal. And that's kind of what's considered critical by the USGS is the magnesium metal part of it, not necessarily the magnesium chloride. But we also have some potential resource in dolomite around the state. We have lots of high purity dolomite in a variety of geologic formations. And dolomite is a magnesium-rich carbonate rock. And currently there are other states in the US that are looking at producing magnesium metal from dolomite, but to my knowledge, there's no interest in that in Utah currently. So.
Okay, going on to potash. So there are 3 currently operating facilities. One is Compass Minerals on the west side of Ogden, producing potassium sulfate from the Great Salt Lake. And it's I think it's the only potassium sulfate producer in the United States and one of the few in the world. There's also Intrepid Potash in Wendover area, and also near Dead Horse Point State Park by Moab. They produce potassium chloride. The potassium sulfate that's produced by Compass is a little bit more valuable, quite a bit more valuable as a fertilizer, because you don't have the problems with chloride toxicity that you get in a lot of crops. There are also some other potential resources. That we have 2 mines, one at Spear Lake and one at Blonde Mountain, that have both received tentative approval. We don't have the bonds yet for those, so they don't have final approval and aren't producing. But those are possibilities for the future. Anything more you'd want to add to that, Andrew? I think I've got the right person now.
Sure. So Paul covered most of it, but I think it's important to cover to mention that Utah really is kind of unique. There's a lot of resource potential in Utah for potash, and it's in a variety of different deposits, which is pretty unique. So we have brine deposits, which are actively producing. We have evaporite deposits, which are actively producing, and we have alunite deposits, which are not currently producing, but there's interest in those deposits. And I'll talk a little bit more about alunite when we get to aluminum. But again, as Paul mentioned, there's in the last decade, each of these deposit types has been looked at, and again, probably the most advanced project is Severe Lake, but their project is stalled out a little bit. They're kind of looking for capital to keep that going, and they're interested in producing potassium sulfate. So as Paul mentioned, that's kind of the more valuable form of potash. But as far as potash goes, Utah is in a pretty strong position to be a continued and future producer.
Okay, and here's some production information, and this is from a report that's published by the Utah Geological Survey. And then I think this is Stephanie to talk about these minerals from the Bingham Canyon mine.
Right. So a lot of the commodities that we've spoken about are produced as either potential or what we call a primary, or what we call a byproduct production. So when we talked about lithium, that's a type of byproduct production because magnesium is the primary there. So we all know for Bingham Canyon, the primaries are things like, well, primarily copper, also gold, silver, and molybdenum. But in addition to that, there are actually several byproducts that are produced from the mine. So platinum and palladium come out in the precious metal, what's called slimes, basically the leftover solution after gold and silver have been separated out. So those are not refined as the actual metals, platinum and palladium, but they are concentrated into what's called a selenium crude powder product and are sold that way. So we still count that as byproduct production from here in Utah. Rhenium is a very common byproduct from molybdenum. The molybdenum from Bingham Canyon is actually processed out of state, but recently, as a part of a critical minerals initiative, Bingham Canyon has also been exploring the potential of recovering rhenium from the copper refinery, basically from scrubbing the rhenium out of the solution in the basically extracting it from the waste stream. And then tellurium, as we discussed, is a brand new one that's going to kind of be its own spike off of the copper refining stream as well. So Bingham Canyon, and in addition to that, there's also lead carbonate that's produced and several other byproducts that aren't critical minerals, but these are the ones that fall within the critical mineral category. So without going into too much metallurgical detail, that's kind of how those byproducts figure in. If you do have any other questions about this in particular, please just let me know.
And Andrew mentioned aluminum just a little bit. It's, I guess I would say, and it's a potential product that would come from the Blonde Mountain mine from alunite. Their primary focus when this was being permitted was potassium sulfate, but they also did have the potential of producing aluminum. And Andrew, you can go into that a little bit further.
So in the U.S., we don't have any really what are considered conventional aluminum resources, but we do have some what are considered unconventional resources. And one of those is alunite. And that's as Paul mentioned, that's sort of a potassium sulfate mineral, hence the potash and aluminum potential for production. And it turns out Utah has the largest alunite deposit in the U.S., and it's a pretty significant deposit. On the map there, you can see black dots, which represent a variety of alunite deposits across the state. But the Blonde Mountain deposit has been looked at a couple different times in the past. and pretty heavily in the last decade. And again, the company there looking at developing that property is kind of run into some looking for capitals to keep the project moving. But yeah, they could potentially produce potash, but also alumina as either co-product or byproduct. And most of the other alunite deposit in the state are not as significant. I suspect they'd more likely be an alternate feed for the Blonde Mountain project if that ever gets up and running, rather than independent deposits.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And another one is fluorspar. The Utah has kind of a unique deposit there, which is really close to the Topaz Beryllium mine in western Juab County. It's the Lost Sheep mine, and that's recently been transferred to a Canadian company called Ares Strategic Minerals, which is doing some exploration and mine planning work currently. Anything more you'd want to say, Stephanie, or I guess it's probably Stephanie or Andrew?
So this
Sorry, I never know
fluorspar is
who.
another industrial mineral, but I would just maybe add, there you see lots of dots on the map there. We've got lots of scattered deposits, but really most past production and most future potential is at the Spore Mountain area. The area that Paul mentioned where the Lost Sheep mine is. I think that's probably all I would need to add.
Okay, all right, thank you. And indium is something I do not know anything about.
So indium, we're not currently producing indium. This falls into, as you can see, the header, defined resources. So this deposit, which is known as the West Desert deposit, has previously been known as the crypto deposit, has what's called an NI 43-101. So basically a stock market compliant level of established resource, so that there's confidence in these numbers. This deposit is actually a copper zinc primary deposit, and indium is then the third commodity that they kind of list. But the interesting thing about indium, there's no domestic production, and this is really more or less the only known established resource within the whole of the US. So this is a really geologically very interesting, but also economically speaking, a very interesting deposit for Utah. And the company is still trying to progress and move forward, certainly with this. So we think, I did recalculate this number based on recent indium production and consumption numbers, and it's actually closer to 7 to 10 years, but still a significant resource. And indium is essential for touchscreens. So basically any sort of electronic that has a electrically conductive screen on it, so anything you can touch, is dependent on indium. So it's actually a very important critical mineral, shockingly. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk just a little bit about uranium and vanadium. Utah has about 5 or 6 permitted uranium/vanadium mines, all in the San Juan and Garfield counties. They're not currently producing. They have produced a little bit over the past few years. They were producing more back in about 2010 or so, but they're all fully permitted, fully bonded, and so could come into production really at just about any time. I think it's important to know that Utah is the only operational uranium and vanadium mill in the United States, and we'll talk more about that just a little bit when we talk about rare earth elements. Just a little bit about production. Like I said, there hasn't been a lot of production over the last 5 years, but there has been a little bit, and it's largely price dependent. Anything more you'd want to add to this, Stephanie, I guess, or Andrew?
Yeah, that's all good. I just was going to clarify, Utah numbers can be a little confusing because we have White Mesa Mill, which produces the refined product, but we also have our mines. So the production here that Energy Fuels mainly has reported is not from material mined in Utah. They process what's called alternate feeds that are shipped into the state. It's usually material that's getting cleaned up from old uranium operations. They did have a little bit of test mining from 2018 to 2019, and they produced about 11,000 tons of ore. They were hoping that they were going to be able to transition into a strong vanadium production circuit, and that was what the test mining was targeting. But unfortunately, the vanadium price didn't stabilize where they needed it to, so that fell through. So just to clarify that right now there's not really mining going on, but the mill is producing. So we kind of we try to keep those two numbers a little bit separate. Most of the ground held in existing established resources in the area is held by US or Canadian companies, things like Energy Fuels, Western Uranium and Vanadium Resources. But an interesting shift has been the entrance of a lot of Australian junior exploration companies over the past year or two that are looking at primarily vanadium, but also uranium exploration. So we're starting to see a bit of a shift in the exploration scene down in Southeast Utah, and it'll be interesting to see how that resolves.
No, that's true. I forgot to mention that. We have had a little bit of exploration going on in Garfield and San Juan counties. That's true.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned the White Mesa Mill in regard to rare earth elements. So if you'd like to talk about this just a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Utah doesn't have a primary rare earth deposit. So we don't have any sort of geological deposit that would be produced primarily for rare earth. So what we look at mostly in Utah is potential byproduct production. Again, going back to that concept of byproduct. Our best option for that would actually be the Spore Mountain District, although there's been very little work done on this. So there's certainly, this is not what we call an established resource. This is a potential. This would take a lot of work to establish. But we do know that the chemistry there is conducive to the type that would potentially produce rare earth elements. So as far as Utah's geology, there's probably nothing, no screaming deposit that we anticipate going into production anytime soon. But then I guess, Paul, did you want to talk about White Mesa's pivot towards rare earth?
Yeah, I'll mention that. But yeah, any details, please feel free to add. So Energy Fuels, which operates the White Mesa Mill, recently had a press release that they were going to be importing a mineral called monazite from a mine in Georgia, and then extracting uranium for one thing, but also some rare earth elements for that they would then ship to a plant in Estonia for further refining. And so that's really about all I know. So Stephanie, you may want to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so basically White Mesa is positioning itself as an intermediary processing because the processing of rare earths is very complicated. It's obviously not just one or two elements, it's an entire suite of elements, and it does take quite specialized processing metallurgically. So they're taking the raw product from Georgia and producing a concentrate, and then that concentrate is getting shipped to Estonia for refinement into final products. And the idea being proving that a rare earth stream can be done completely outside of using any facility in China or Russia. So that is keeping it mostly domestic until the final step. And they've only just started. I mean, this is, I think you and I were talking about this, Paul, this is really quite new that they've started doing it, but they're very optimistic, I think.
Yeah, and they've talked about further expansion too. So we'll keep an eye on that. And this is going back to the periodic table that we were showing earlier. Anything more, Andrew or Stephanie? Anything more you'd like to add?
I think we're probably happy to take questions. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Oh yeah,
No.
Or if there are any questions.
Board members, Rich, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, this is Rich Borden. Given the global significance of that Spore Mountain deposit, how many years of production do they have left, and what are their published reserves? And is there any greenfields or brownfields exploration potential in that district for expansion?
Yep. So the Spore Mountain District has been in production continuously since 1968. The original company was Brush Wellman, which may ring a bell for a couple of people who've been around. And it transitioned to Materion in I think the 90s. Their proven and probable established reserves are enough for another 75 years at current production levels. So it is a beautiful deposit that's been going for a while and shows no sign of slowing down at this point. If the aerospace and defense industries ramp up, and because that's primarily where beryllium is used, it's a lightweight alloy that can go into a lot of metals for aerospace and defense. I very much believe Materion can ramp up to meet that demand with their Spore Mountain deposit. So it ticks along. It's doing well.
Great, thank you.
Board members, any other questions? This has been a very interesting presentation. Mike Brown. Mike, I think you're muted. Hands in the air, he's frustrated.
If you'd like to, you could pose a question in the chat.
This is something we probably need to get resolved. I believe he's waving us off, but we will work on getting his microphone set up so that he can participate in the rest of the hearing. Any other questions or comments? Susan?
We were working with companies that were interested in producing the Blonde Mountain Mine at Questar years ago, and it was not the economics are good, but they didn't have the capital they needed. What's going on there? Who owns it? Do you know how likely this is to get produced?
I can't really say how likely it is. It's a company called Utah Alunite, and it's pretty much what you just said, that they need to come up with the capital so they can submit a bond with us. There has been talk in the past few years about them scaling back the operation. As it was going to be really quite a large bond and very large tailings pond, a really big operation. And so, it may be more feasible for them to start off a little bit smaller. But I can't really say anything more than that.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the board?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Well, yes, we can, Mr. Brown.
So I flew out and came back in. I just have one question. I had the same question as Rich about reserves, but I also have a question that will date me. In the 90s, our large magnesium producer out on the lake was one of the largest HAP producers, hazardous air pollutant producers in the United States. Do either of you folks, or I go a long ways back with Andrew, by the way, too, but do any of you know if they've been able to arrest or reduce those emissions, those air emissions?
I can't talk too specifically about that, but yes, I do know that they have reduced them substantially. In fact, something upwards of 90%, I believe. Again, I'm not absolutely positive of that, but I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Thank you, Paul. That's all I had, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Seeing no other comments or questions from the board members, turn the time back over to you, Mr. Baker.
Well, thank you. I'll yield back to Mr. Baza.
Well, thank you all. That was a very comprehensive report, and as board members will recognize, it's an intriguing subject, and it would be easy to go down the rabbit hole on any of these elemental minerals that we're dealing with in the state of Utah. But it's a good overview and probably something to be aware of going forward. So thank you, Paul, Andrew, and Stephanie. I appreciate your time and effort on this. So the next couple of briefing items are going to be pretty quick. So I think we'll be able to cover them quite adequately in the time we have left. The first is an update on pilot project reports. This is specifically related to horizontal drilling in the Uinta Basin. We had understood that the board was interested in the progress of those pilot projects and what the division was doing to monitor those activities. So I'm going to turn the time over to Bart Kettle, our Deputy Director for Oil and Gas, and he'll give you that update.
Thank you, Director Baza. I'm Bart Kettle, Deputy Director with the Oil and Gas Program. Today I will be discussing pilot project reporting as it relates to horizontal well spacing orders in my briefing presentation. Reporting requirements are detailed on an order-by-order basis. And one of the first things I learned preparing for today's presentation was the fact that it can be a little cumbersome to extract information of interest when you're required to search for that report order by order. And so I think it's worth discussion today whether the era of pilot projects has passed. Horizontal well drilling in the Uinta Basin has entered a more mature phase of development. Much expertise and knowledge has been gained since the initial reporting requirements were placed in order. Reporting requirements requested might include things such as appropriateness of size of drilling units, spaced intervals, whether information obtained in development better defines drainage for vertical and horizontal wells, appropriateness of drilling unit boundary setbacks as affected by fracture distance and orientation, observed drainage behavior, and appropriateness of interwell setbacks in terms of maximizing production and preserving future options for secondary and tertiary recovery. It's been the division's observation as information regarding these technical subject matters is better understood by industry, they bring it to the board in great detail in future spacing hearings. And in fact, one of the things that I noticed as I was preparing for today's briefing is submitted reports will often reference exhibits for future testimony in their content. One thing that I would like to focus on briefly with the board deals with administrative rules regarding horizontal drilling. Reporting requirements request information regarding input for how Utah Administrative Code as it pertains to vertical and horizontal wells might be updated and improved. And once again, I think it's noteworthy that horizontal development has entered a more mature phase in the Uinta Basin. The knowledge and expertise within industry and within the division staff both has sufficiently increased to engage a robust stakeholder discussion regarding standardized horizontal drilling rules. And so if I can kind of paraphrase some of the things that I noted in reports, it would be the board should consider adopting administrative rules for all horizontal drilling units. Adoption of such administrative rules will create a standard development scheme that will facilitate combined development via vertical, directional, and horizontal wells. As the board may recall, rulemaking by the division has been paused this past year with the passage of Senate Bill 6004 in the 6th special session. If the board wishes, it may be appropriate to resume horizontal drilling rulemaking in the near future, recognizing several restraints. One being there is desire both internally and from industry externally for multiple rulemakings currently in place for the oil and gas program as well as the minerals program. And also recognizing there are limitations to the amount of time that both the board personnel and the division staff can dedicate to any one individual rulemaking. So in summary, I would like to present kind of 3 thoughts for the board to consider regarding reporting requirements for horizontal wells. The first being primarily horizontal well development has moved beyond the pilot stage. It could be that reports are no longer necessary and can be discontinued, or reporting intervals can be streamlined at the board's discretion. And tying into that, the technical information requested by recording requirements is being presented in great detail as it becomes available to the board at future hearings. The third thought that I would like to place as I start to wrap up is there is a need for standardized horizontal drilling rules in the administrative role. We believe there's sufficient expertise and experience for the robust stakeholder interaction needed to develop such a rulemaking. And so at this time, what I would do is I would ask the board what additional topics you might request the division cover regarding reporting requirements in future board hearings, and maybe any direction you might give us. With that, Director Baza, I'll yield back to you for questions or additional comment.
I did want to add to what Bart was saying regarding rulemaking. We've realized that each rulemaking requires a considerable amount of division, time, and effort. And recently, with the addition of board members participating in stakeholder meetings, it's taking up time by board members as well. So we have several rulemakings in concept that are being looked at. And I just wanted to let you as a board know that I intend to give you a briefing on potential rulemakings at next month's board meeting, the April board meeting. So maybe we can have a better discussion on how to prioritize those rulemakings. We're just seeing that it may exceed the capacity of the division to do more than one or two rulemakings concurrently. So with that, I will offer opportunity for the board to ask any questions of either Bart or myself.
Ms. Davis?
Seems like we were quite far down the road with horizontal rulemaking before COVID hit and everything stopped. Can we just pull out the rulemaking and finalize it? I mean, it looked like it was pretty close when we suspended activity on that rule.
Ms. Davis, I'll respond to that and just say that yes, we were close. We had some drafts that were being circulated, but one thing we have learned as we've done recent stakeholder engagements is we're getting a more robust attention by other parties besides our traditional players in all of our rulemaking. So we need to take a different approach on how we have circulated those drafts and have those discussions in a more intense manner. So I think you're right that we were close and it would easily be one that we could pick up, but because of what Bart said and the pause legislation of Senate Bill 6004, where we can have stakeholder discussions, but we cannot initiate rulemaking until after July 1st.
I would just hate not to move forward on that one, especially with the information Bart just said. We've been in the pilot era for, gosh, is it 5 years now or more? I think this, if I had to prioritize, this is the one I'd put on the top. This is rulemaking I'd put on the top.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Other board members, do you have comments or suggestions? I guess I have just a couple of questions on the pilot projects. If we feel like it's time, their time has essentially concluded, would it not make sense to create some sort of summary or report of what we've learned that's good and what's not good, so that we could consider those things as we go forward in rulemaking? Were they successful? Why were they successful? What parts of them were not successful, if any? It just seems like a summary might be useful if we're going to end the pilot programs. Does that make sense, or am I off base here on this, Mr. Baza?
I think you're entirely appropriate in asking for that, Mr. Chairman. And I think with that direction, the division needs to do a little homework. One of the things we realized, and Mr. Kettle referred to this, was that as we began searching order by order, it was difficult to discern how many of those were actually categorized as a pilot project and how many were just additional reporting requirements required by a particular spacing order. So we'll have to sort through that and perhaps bring back to you as a board a better inventory of what we did learn from those pilot projects.
Yeah, and I don't, I'm not recommending an in-depth dissertation necessarily. It's just, it would be nice to have a summary of what we learned and why it was a success or a failure. Well, thank you. I appreciate your.
I would like to second what Chris just said. I think this is one of the more critical things that the board has done in the last 5 years, and I think a summary is definitely in order.
Well, we will proceed in that direction then.
Thank you, Mr. Baza.
If there are no other questions, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move on to our next briefing item.
Please do. I do not see any further questions or board members asking for comments. So.
And this last item will probably be very quick, but at the close of the legislative session, we normally summarize actions taken by the legislature. And to do that today, I'm going to turn to our legislative liaison, Natasha Baliff, and have her give you a description of what took place at the legislative session.
Yes, good morning. I have a graphic that I'm going to hurry and throw up on the screen.
And Natasha, go ahead and introduce yourself again.
Okay. All right. Can you guys all see the graphic?
Yes.
Okay. To introduce myself, I'm Natasha Baliff. I will be giving a legislative update from the 2021 general session. To start off, we have House Bill 79, which amended the definition of basalt. This was somewhat a continuation from the 2020 general session bill that exempted basalt from mining operations. This year, the definition was just fine-tuned. And because this bill was passed, we will need to amend our R647 rules to match the statute definition. Moving on to House Bill 346 and 368. House Bill 346 moves the Office of Energy Development over to DNR, and HB 368 moves the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, or PLPCO, over to DNR. So both of these buildings will create better coordination throughout the department. And last update I heard was that PLPCO will be moving into the DNR office while OED will stay where they are because of a building lease. Moving on to Senate Bill 72 and Senate Bill 125. They're similar in that they both deal with open and public meetings. SB 72 does not allow for any votes in a closed meeting. That one was a pretty short and to the point bill. And then SB 125 is kind of in response to COVID-19 and meeting locations. So SB 125 will allow meetings to take place if a building is closed or if there is substantial risk to participant health and safety. This gives the chairperson the decision to have a locationless meeting, but there will still be a statement given at the beginning of each meeting. So there really won't be much change from what we've been doing this past year. And Senate Bill 133 is the severance tax revenue bill. This gave OGM, Utah Geological Survey, water quality and air quality restricted accounts to each division. Because of this bill, OGM was given no general funds this legislative session, but as a division, we're hopeful that this bill will allow for a more stable source of funding. And then finally, SB 294 is kind of like a pandemic endgame. It has a termination date for public health orders, which are like the mask mandates, and emergency powers, as the state is reaching certain thresholds for positivity rates and vaccinations. And those thresholds are less than 191 daily positive cases within a 14-day period, and that 1.6 million first doses of the vaccine go out. Those are the major bills that affect the division and just kind of us as citizens of the state. I can take any questions that you may have, and if not, then that concludes my presentation.
Board members, any questions for Natasha? I do not see any. I will be interested to follow the implementation of SB 133. It's interesting that no general funds were allotted for the division. Hopefully we get that worked out fairly quickly.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Baza. We are still trying to sort through what the resulting effect of that is, because even though the restricted account was created that allows an allocation of severance tax, the final appropriation action taken by the legislature in SB 3, I believe, actually removed general funds from the division. So we're still trying to figure out what the impact of that will be, the timing of when the restricted account will start receiving funds. So more to come on that is all I can say.
Thank you.
I also might comment on the fact that we enjoy having Zoom meetings with Natasha because she has an avian coworker who likes to make comments during the meeting. So good to go. Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that we've adequately used up our time. We've got I think a set of marching orders regarding rulemaking, which I'll present to you more next month. But beyond that, I think we're done. And I did want to mention that we will be during the noon hour having a discussion with the board on our Environmental Excellence Awards and nominations. So I just wanted to highlight that that will be taking place today. I'll turn the time back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Baza, Director Baza. Normally, in a public hearing, we would have the opportunity to take public comment, but under the circumstances, that has not been possible in the past, and nor was it for this particular hearing. However, a link to a public comment page was provided on the board's March meeting agenda, and that link was made available to the public on March 17th when the agenda was emailed to stakeholders and posted on the board's website. Comments were to be accepted until 11:59 p.m. Tuesday, March 23rd, last night, and no public comments were submitted. So I think at this point we can close the briefing portion of our hearing today, and we will take a short break and reconvene at 10:15. Okay with everybody? 10:15 we'll reconvene and begin the hearing portion of today's agenda. So we're off the record, and we'll be back at 10:15. Thank you, everyone.